There's a lot of competition, but Bloomberg may have won the prize for the most out-of-touch op-ed of the month, with their piece about how to lessen the sting of inflation if you happen to make less than $300,000 a year. Among their tips, maybe don't buy that extra car, don't buy in bulk, eat lentils instead of meat, and don't treat your pet for cancer if they get it. Seriously. But inflation is real, and the problems it has caused are very real, particularly for poor and moderate income Americans. It's rising at its fastest pace in 40 years, with consumer prices up almost 8% compared to last year, driven by rising housing and food costs and, of course, fuel. In response, the Federal Reserve raised its benchmark interest rate last week, but that comes with its own downsides if you're trying to get a loan or carrying credit card debt. So how much worse is this likely to get, and are lentils really the answer? I'm joined by Michelle Singletary, personal finance columnist for the Washington Post, and Dan Primack, business editor at Axios. Dan, Michelle, it's great to see you both. Thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So, Dan, starting with you, it seemed to me last week what the head of the Fed, Jerome Powell, was saying was by the end of next year, things are going to calm down on the inflation front. Today he speaks in front of what is it called, the National Association for Business Economics, and he talks about how widely underestimated the length of the inflation problem is going to be. What is he saying exactly about inflation?
Well, for starters, I should point out he didn't talk about lentils, and the price of lentils is actually inflated too, and Bloomberg totally missed that. That's real. What he's really saying is we being the people in the Fed and lots of economists, have screwed this up. There's been talk for a long time that inflation was, quote, transitory. That was what we heard from the White House. It hasn't been. This has gone on much longer than expected, and really what the Fed normally does in this sort of circumstance historically is raise rates. And what you really heard from Powell today was, we were already on a path to raise rates kind of gradually. We've known that for well over a year. We might get much more aggressive if things don't slow down.
And Dan, one more thing I know that all along Powell has been saying this is mostly pandemic-related problems, supply chains, et cetera. How much does Ukraine factor into his calculations these days?
It factors a lot, right? I mean, the supply chain, the pandemic was the beginning of this. Look, so was, and as a piece of that was an enormous amount of government spending tied to that. But Ukraine is a huge wild card. I mean, the pandemic has been too. Obviously, we didn't know Omicron was going to show up when it did. Ukraine just makes things more complicated, particularly when it comes to energy prices. So,
Michelle, while the future is iffy, the present is not. We know the numbers are real, and we mostly, I think about fuel, groceries, that sort of thing. Where else is inflation hitting the average American hardest?
I think it's big ticket items like used cars, because this is a group of people who are more likely, if they need a vehicle, are going to go to the used car market, which we've been telling them to do, right? Buy a used car. It's less expensive, except for now it's not so much because the new car prices are so high because supply is less because of the chip shortage. So then people turn to the used car market, and now they're, outbidding each other for these cars that would have, not been such a big deal, 3 or 4 years ago. And so housing, rent, buying a home, all of those big things, that's what impacts people's budgets more than lentils. Clearly they never talked to somebody who's been living on the edge because they already eat beans and rice. And so that's where it's hitting people the most, the ability to send your child to college without a boatload of debt. Those are the things that impact families' finances over the long term.
Michelle, I don't want to I'm clearly not attempting to minimize the pain, economic pain this has caused, but if people who read your column, you're sort of a part-time shrink, I would argue too, or at least you read the minds, I think, of the average person reading it. Because people feel so overwhelmed, do they sometimes see inflation where it isn't? Do you know what I mean? Even in places where we're not getting socked, because overall the impact is so overwhelming.
I don't know if they don't see what's not there already. I think that any price increase, even if it's not as much as the average, a price increase for these big ticket things, it hurts them. If you are already $20 away from a financial disaster, inflation just makes it that much worse. But I think what happens is when things get tight and people can't make do, then bad decisions kind of come into play because you're so overwhelmed. And really, I think that's what is happening with a lot of people. So for example, housing. housing. So people were like, rents are going up and people bemoaning it. But instead of saying, okay, I can't move out of mama's house right now, I need to stay there, or I need to still have all of these roommates rather than try to live on my own. But people don't want to hear that, even though they need to hear it.
Dan, back to you. I want to stay in terms of the psyche part of this for a second. You wrote a month ago about the economy being booming, but if you're a Republican, you don't think it's booming because everything is partisan. Does that apply to inflation as well, or are the fears
to
sort
some
of
extent,
uniform?
yes. I will admit I wrote that prior to the Ukraine war
Right,
and
I know
gas prices going through the roof. But to a certain extent, yeah, I think it does. Look, it is certainly true that inflation is rising higher at a higher percentage than wages are. That is true. So even if you've gotten a raise, you have probably kind of lost real money, depending on what you do for a living. But that said, this is still the best job market really of my lifetime. And I think, Jim, probably of yours as well, in terms of the number of jobs out there and what companies of all sorts are willing to pay for those jobs. And I do think we are at this point, and I think you see this kind of politically when it comes to Ukraine as well, where the party that is out of power not only is arguing that their policies are better and would make things better, but are arguing the current situation is awful, even if many parts of it are not. And I think we saw the reverse of that when Trump was in office with Democrats. And clearly there were economic problems, inequality, et cetera. But generally speaking, it was a fairly good economy by U.S. standards.
Michelle, you touched a second ago on the fact that essentially the average consumer has gotten coming and going. In addition to the price increases as a result of inflation, the Fed then raises interest rates. And then, of course, the other half of the equation, mortgage rates go up, ultimately credit card rates go up. But there is some good news. I mean, it's hard to find here. I mean, Social Security increases were pretty dramatic this year because they're tied to inflation. Is there any other good news as a result of inflation, or is that it?
Well, I think there is good news. We just talked about, there's more jobs. Companies are more willing to negotiate higher raises. You can get a better, sort of entry level job. We're waiting for the Fed to, at some point raise the minimum wage, but many states and companies are already doing that. So I think that's the good news, that if you've got some skills and experience, then you are in the driver's seat for a lot of the jobs that you might be looking for. Now, we also have to look at the fact that even though there are a lot of jobs out there, they're just playing catch up. It's not as if they were making, really good money and now it's great money. They were already under, and now they're kind of coming back to where they should be, paying people a living wage. So it's good news, but it's not as good as it could have been had we put in place some things before the pandemic, like a living wage, like, making sure people can afford housing and things like that.
Well, I mean, some employers are being forced to address wages. I think this was intimated in there because they can't get workers. So whether it's out of empathy or necessity, they're doing that. And by the way, those people aren't in the driver's seat if they can't afford the gas, by the way. Dan, is government doing enough here? I mean, for example, today we have a New York Times headline. Joe Biden is talking about ocean vessels and some new regulations. And clearly, the costs of bringing things across oceans are going up dramatically. It's taking longer time and that sort of thing. But is the government doing all it can? Because the Joe Manchins of the world are worried, and the Republicans with Joe Manchin, if they do more, they're going to cause an even further spike in inflation.
I think to Manchin's concerns, I think the big answer is we don't know, right? We don't know if he's right and we don't know if he's wrong. And I think we've kind of shown that over the last 2 years of pandemic spending and policy, that some things work, some things don't. And there are some unintended consequences. For example, we, for very good reason, helped kind of everybody out in the early days of the pandemic with money. One of the things that created was a lot more consumer demand for products, more consumer demand than could get on ships. And suddenly there were supply chain issues. So there are certainly unintended consequences, but that goes on both sides of the equation. So I'm not really I don't want to say that government is doing as much as it should, or too much or too little. I honestly think these are unprecedented times, and I don't think anyone quite knows for sure.
Michelle, can you give a minute of advice? I watched your video that said, don't go to your employer saying, give me a raise because of inflation based on your job performance. You mentioned a minute ago, maybe you have to stay with your mother at her house a little bit longer. What other advice do you give to people who do feel overwhelmed and fear this is never going to end?
So, I hate to sort of repeat myself, but look at the big ticket items. We like to focus on food and gas, but that's not why people end up staying in poverty forever. It's the big things, housing, taking on debt for college. Like right now, in a couple of months, lots of families are going to be deciding whether or not to send their kids to college. And many of those families will make the wrong choice. They'll send their kids to colleges they can't afford, and they'll get loans for them. And so right now is the moment to make better financial decisions wherever you are. If you are just getting by, housing is the big thing. You can't spend 40 or 50% or 70% of your salary on housing. Large with more people, move in, get more roommates if you've got the space. And then again, college, make the right decision. Don't take on all those debts. When you negotiate for a job, think about everything that goes along with it, the whole package, health insurance, all of that kinds of things. Maybe you shouldn't move to a bigger city for a bigger salary if that's going to stretch you more. Those are the kinds of things that will make the difference for you long term. And if you've got room in your budget, because there are many people who are doing well, this is a time to boost your retirement savings. This is a time to boost your savings, to cushion yourself for that next economic downturn, which will come.
Before we go, Dan Primack, can you do what Jerome Powell appears unable to do? Do a little Nostradamus action? How long and how bad inflation?
The big caveat to this is Russia and Ukraine, right? I mean, if you can tell me how that's going to end and when that's going to end, then I'd be a little better in this. Most economists believe that inflation is going to slow by the end of the year to kind of 4.2% or something like that, which would be lower than it is right now. I generally tend to agree with that. But again, if the conflagration in Europe kind of expands, if there's something with China and Taiwan, God forbid, which would make what's happening in Russia and Ukraine look like a molehill, then all bets are off.
Michelle Singletary, Dan Primack, as always, thanks so much. Great to see you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.